Hey everyone, back again. Okay, let us continue with Fichte's The Science of Knowledge, the second half of Fichte's The Science of Knowledge, starting from the first part of the theoretical part of the science of knowledge. So there's going to be two parts to the theoretical part, then he's going to go into the practical part. We're going to cover that all here. Follow the links in the descriptions if you want to follow me other places or support me as much as you'd like. Okay, so what he's going to be doing here, at least in the second half of the science of knowledge, is to try to understand how it is possible that there can be a relationship between an ego, that is a consciousness or a being, and the world, or another being, or anything else that is not the ego. So throughout the rest of the book, he's going to be talking a lot about the relationship between the ego and the non-ego. Now, if you're familiar with Hegel, this is very much a precursor to Hegel in a lot of cases. There are some diehard German idealists out there that are very convinced that there isn't such a neat continuity between Fichte and Hegel, but I think there is. In any case, where Hegel will be different is that Hegel is not quite as committed to the distinction between ego, or the self, and the non-ego. Where for Hegel, if you read it, like these things really seem to blend together. Now, with that being said, and I mentioned this last time, Fichte's also clear about this. He's clear about this insofar as he says that the self is never really just its self. Rather, if we are truly to understand the self, or we are truly to understand what consciousness is, it means coming to terms with the fact that consciousness embeds otherness within it. So in simple terms, what that means is that you develop, or any of us develops, a sense of self throughout the course of our lives. However, you don't develop a sense of self in isolation with yourself. You actually never spend that much time, if any time at all, just purely with yourself. I mean, the way that you think about yourself comes to you through a language. You know, the inner voice in your head is through a language. You think through images. You engage through things in the world. All of this implies that your sense of self is bound up with you having had experiences of other things in your life. Whether it's language, whether it's objects in the world, whether it's other people, all of this implies that your sense of self, and this is Fichte talking here, your sense of self actually has elements of non-self within it. And so as he'll say later on, he's very clear. I mean, this is a direct quote from page 277 in my version. He's like, the ego is therefore to find originally in itself a heterogeneous, foreign, distinguishable other. That is to say that in the self, there is otherness. And this is something that Hegel picks up on, but Hegel is going to take this in a much more deliberate and extreme direction, where he's going to completely collapse any possible distinction between ego and non-ego, something that Fichte doesn't really commit to. And you'll see throughout as we go on here, Fichte is going to really maintain this neat distinction, even if he does recognize that there are elements of the self in the other in the self, and even vice versa. So if we're going to start thinking about the distinction between the self and the non-self, or the ego and the non-ego, we have to think about three what he calls logical propositions that are embedded within the very possibility of recognizing this distinction. And he says that these are the focus upon identity, upon opposition, and upon ground, where what these refer to are identity, which is just these two separate things on their own, where you have self, non-self, or ego, non-ego. He talks about opposition, the importance of their being opposed, and what that implies, given the fact that they still have a relationship with one another. And then the ground. And by the ground, he's referring to what makes their communion possible, or what makes it possible for the self to have a relationship with what is not itself. Now, it's interesting that he refers to this as logical propositions, because if you remember from last time, he's also moving away from logic. He's not just trying to give us a simple arithmetic to understand whatever the ego is in relation to a non-ego. Because he's I'm actually interested in the very possibility of science at all, or knowledge at all, which is a very dynamic thing. It isn't very easily configurable according to a formula, which is what, I mean, I try as much to leave out my editorials when I do these things, but like, so many questions today about like, if you spend any time online, people asking questions like, is mathematics or science or whatever, is it discovered or is it created? And this misses the more fundamental question of how it is even possible for human beings to commit themselves to any kind of like formulaic understanding of the world in any way, shape, or form, even if it's not like, even if it doesn't like adhere to something like a science. Even if we think about the kind of sexist distinction between like emotionality and rationality, where we often attribute rationality with being like consistent and having a kind of like internal coherence. The same applies to like emotionality. We're able to attribute a set of different qualities or attributes or like interactions, expressions to a certain word of an emotion, which is itself like a very fascinating thing that we're able to do. But that, of course, it's not worthy of investigation because it's been so historically associated with like inconsistency, therefore with femininity, and therefore not worthy of deep consideration. But I mean, regardless, essentially what Fichte is after here is the question of what makes it possible for us to be able to have any kind of like consistency in our relationship to a world that allows us to have engagement with it, allows us to be predictive, because this is what makes us like very interestingly human in a lot of cases. I think that there's very good debates that have been made about how animals possess a similar quality, and so the same can extend to all living creatures. I don't want to come off as a total, I'm just totally anthropomorphic here, but this is a question that Kant raises in the third critique, where Kant says, he's like, look, humans possess this very interesting ability to essentially move beyond nature. Like it's very fascinating how we have this thing called consciousness. That is, if you're a materialist, that is, if you just like believe in evolution, for example, if we just like emerged from the earth, or just like a product of various haphazard coincidences on planet Earth, it's very fascinating that we develop something that is not of the earth, like consciousness. Like it's a very strange thing. And consciousness allows us to then not just be totally beholden to evolutionary demand. Like we aren't actually determined by evolution in any way, shape, or form. We have something called language that allows us to like negotiate nature, to negotiate our programming, and to do new things, which is incredibly mysterious. And this is what Kant is sort of, the question that Kant is probing in the third critique is like, what is going on here that allows us as human beings not to just, for example, eat food for the sake of sustaining ourselves, which would be an evolutionary claim. That's why we eat, just to keep ourselves alive. But instead we eat to eat things that we enjoy. It has no evolutionary like benefit per se. Or why do we like take enjoyment in like art, whatever it is, like, and we're able to have it affect us in a way that's common among other people. Like this is something that doesn't seem to be embedded within any kind of natural or material programming. And this is me saying this as an a-religious atheist, but I think it's a fascinating component of being a human or being any kind of living creature. So Fichte is posing these questions essentially to find out what makes it possible for us to have knowledge at all. How is it possible for, at its most basic form, for a human being, for a consciousness, or to any living being, to be able to have a relationship with the world that is not itself, that is not us, yet we are able to find a kind of harmony and communion and connection, and able to find things like patterns, able to find like, beauty, whatever, in this thing that is not us. Or more importantly, how it is possible that we actually develop any knowledge at all by engaging with a thing that is not us, that is the world. So acknowledging this, he says, okay, there are two big possibilities here. Either then, it is that the mind, the ego, consciousness, essentially gives a limit to the world. So this is like an old idealist claim. So idealism, not like German idealism, because that would be its own kind of thing, but idealism before Kant essentially said that the world doesn't exist. It's just the product of our minds. Nothing in the world exists. It's just like our minds like giving a kind of shape, giving a kind of structure to the world. And then along would come Kant and be like, that's silly because there are changes in the world. Like, you can't watch the sunset and tell me that there isn't something exterior to me that is occurring. I can't be sure of what that thing is. I can never like really know what that is. I can't touch that thing in itself or like, really be with that thing because it's always filtered through my senses. But there is something out there. But the old idealists like Berkeley and others were making this claim that the world doesn't exist. It's just purely the product of our minds. And our minds kind of give it a certain structure. So there are two big possibilities here. It is either that the world, that is the non-ego, that is that which is exterior to us, is therefore limited by our minds, by the ego. So everything that you see right now is like there's a bordering around it. Like, imagine that when we're talking about experience, we're just talking about what you can see. Like, and I really, or for anyone who's is unable to see, who's listening to this, whatever is in the horizon of what you can hear right now, or anything that you're able to experience, just to narrow it down to one sense. Imagine that is the horizon of everything that you can possibly experience. Like what you're seeing right in front of you right now, whether you're driving and listening to my voice or you're doing something else, whatever is right in front of you right now, imagine this is like the border of all that can be seen. This implies, through this first possibility, that the world is contained by what your mind allows. And, obviously it extends beyond that. But the idea is that whatever is given as possible within experience is only permissible by the limits of our minds, which is infinite, but like, our senses are only able to take in so much. The world is like, therefore limited in that capacity. Now, we first did this as the practical possibility of the relationship between the ego and the non-ego. Now, on the other side of things, it could very well be that it is actually that the non-ego, that is the world, limits our minds, which implies that it has a certain like autonomy that exists separate from us. And so it is clear here that he's moving away from, or he's really accepted what Kant has said, and he's like, look, the exterior world might have a certain truth to it that is exterior to us. Even if I can't be sure of it, it might still like have some effects upon us that we can't be totally sure of. So what this implies is that if we were to accept this idea, it is that the external world effectively determines our minds. It shapes us. But this is a contradiction because for Fichte, he's like, well, although I'm not ready to say, look, consciousness is what fundamentally determines all things, as those old idealists would say, he's also going to recognize the fact that if I make the claim that the external world kind of configures or places a limit on our mind, on our ego, I am using my ego to make this observation. And I am using an ego that essentially we can all, I think, all accept, plays some part in the structuring of the world. That is, when we engage with the world, we aren't engaging with it like truthfully, but really what our mind permits through our senses. And so he's like, it can't really be so neat as either my mind shapes the world or the world shapes my mind. Instead, we have to do more work here to figure out what is going on to kind of connect these two things. And, a lot of you have maybe listened to me for a while, and maybe you'll find this interesting. I imagine it's only people who've probably been listening to me for a while who are listening to this, and you didn't just stumble on this. But one of the other reasons I've been gone for a while, I've had some personal stuff that's taken me away from thinking about this stuff a little bit. But I also wanted to take some time to just sit with philosophy for a bit and to just read stuff. Because for the last 10 years, almost 10 years I've been doing this, I haven't just sat down and read and just let the stuff kind of percolate within me or let myself kind of absorb it. Whenever I've read something, I'm sitting there taking notes and desperately trying to understand it. And I'm reading other articles and trying to get what's going on. And then trying to figure out how to put the stuff into accessible language. But over the last few months, 6 months or so, is the first time I've just been trying to absorb philosophy texts. So I've gone back and I've been reading Kant and Hegel in a very slow and deliberate way, where I'm not taking any notes, not adding to my 1,000-page compendium of notes. I'm just sitting there and absorbing the stuff. And it's been very helpful for me because it's given me a minute to just kind of sit back and take it in. Hence why I'm really in it, because I was reading this text and I'm like, I really got to go back and read Kant and Hegel. That's why I'm inserting so much of them here. But yeah, for those of you who are interested in that personal tidbit. So he's interested here in finding this kind of continuity between the ego and the non-ego. How it isn't one shaping the other per se, but how they actually have effects upon one another. And this is the kind of cornerstone of phenomenology. Phenomenology being the study of phenomena, phenomenology, ology, study of phenomena, that is things in the world, things that are experienced. And so phenomenology is the study of things as they are experienced, which implies that there is a human component or the experiencing subject plays some part in determining the thing that is being experienced, which then itself has an effect upon us. And so phenomenology implies that it's not just how we're affected by things. That's a big part of it. That's certainly a big part of how affect theory would emerge. But there's there's more to it than that. It's about really the give and take between experiencing living beings or beings that experience and the world and things they experience, and how there's a kind of reciprocity here. And this leads him to offer us a term. And this term is reciprocal determination. And this will be a very important term throughout the rest of this book, where he's going to use this idea to find a way for two separate things that are different, in this case the ego and the non-ego, to have a relationship with one another. He says they have a relationship through what he calls reciprocal determination. They both shape one another, and by virtue of that, even though they are different, they share something. They have something in common. And this is what he calls the ground. If we go back to those three propositions mentioned earlier, identity, opposition, and ground, reciprocal determination plays a very important part in this ground. That is what allows there to be a comparison between the two at all. And the same would follow for any kind of logical deduction. There needs to be a kind of commonality between any two or more propositions for there to be intelligibly connected. So it would be smart if I had an example right off the top of my head. But if you were to compare you can't compare apples and oranges because there is no grounding through which you've made the comparison. If you were to then throw in another term that you would use as the ground to make the comparison, these apples and origins are origins. These apples and oranges are the same on the basis of their weight. In this case, the weight kind of serves as the grounding that allows you to make such a comparison. But without that, they just kind of exist in their difference, that you can't make the connection between them. And so reciprocal determination here is going to be one of the key ingredients to making the connect between the non-ego, the world, things in the world, and the ego, the self, consciousness. So really what we were saying is that how it is possible that the ego determines reality, as we experience it, that in turn determines the ego. So to the ego, the non-ego is negation. It's the negative. It's negative in the sense that it is not us. That's all he's referring to here. It's just like the externality of the positivity of the active subject of consciousness, or the active being of consciousness. It's just like what is not consciousness out there. That's what he refers to as negation or negativity, which, if I was at all fluent in German, I'm sure there's a lot more to be said about how these terms are being translated, but I think that you're going to be able to get the idea pretty well, even if we're just dealing with the English counterparts. But it is not purely that what is exterior to consciousness is just negative or negation. It's not so simple as that, because as he's just said, it plays a kind of active role. It shapes us. It plays a part in giving us the foundation of knowledge at all. We cannot be experiencing knowledge beings without having some kind of connection or experience with things in the world. And so by virtue of that, it is not simply that consciousness plays the active role in determining the negative, that is the non-ego that is external to us. That non-ego plays an active role in shaping us. But how is that possible? I mean, we can't actually say that, that tree out there is actively working upon us in the same way as our consciousness is working upon it. I mean, that would be a kind of silly comparison. But it's nevertheless kind of true. Or at least there's some kind of active agency on the part of things in the world that shape us. And we have to really respect that. Otherwise, we fall into this like idealist trap that's just like, oh, the world is just like the projection of our minds. Everything is just constructed by our minds, which isn't really how things work. So now we're seeing how the ego and the non-ego aren't exactly opposites in such a neat way. In fact, they both seem to retain some elements of activity. They both seem to be active, and they both seem to be passive. Consciousness works upon the world works upon us. So we have a little bit of both on each side. Or a little bit of both of activity and passivity passivity on each side. But it gets even stickier when we think about the way in which our ability at all to understand what the ego is as an active being, active agent, requires a sort of operation on the part of the ego to think about itself. So if you think about like Descartes for a second, I mean, this is the core of Descartes' idea, I think, therefore I am. His idea there, for anyone who's not totally familiar, his idea is like, look, I can't be sure of anything in the world. Everything might be a dream, or it might be the product of a dream. What can I be sure of though? And he's like, okay, I can't be sure of this table in front of me. I can't be sure of even the shirt I'm wearing. Hell, I can't even be sure of my own body, because for all I know, that my body is just an illusion. But what you cannot not be sure of is your mind. And the reason for that is that it takes your mind to be able to doubt anything at all. So I can use my mind to doubt the table. I can use my mind to doubt my shirt. I can use my mind to doubt my body. But you can't use your mind to doubt your mind, because it takes your mind to do the doubting. And so what we're left here is something that's always present, that very act of thinking itself. Hence the act of thinking implies that there's some kind of existence there. Something is existing that is not just an illusion, because it confirms itself. So the ego, in looking upon itself, not just looking upon the external world, places itself in a kind of passive position from its active agent, implying that even the sense of self is one that's always fractured. It's fractured as a self that is seen and as a self that is seeing, like it's seeing itself. This is the core of Hegel's idea of self-consciousness, where self-consciousness emerges at a point or a period, call it a period, in one's life, when you recognize that you're not just an experiencing being that just experiences the world, but instead you're a being that can be looked at by other consciousnesses. And in that moment, you're like, oh, I can look at myself. I can reflect upon myself. And so you develop not just consciousness, but self-consciousness. This is like Jacques Lacan's idea of the mirror stage. The mirror stage is the moment in which you see yourself as a being that can be looked at. So you see people as like images. When you see someone in the world, you aren't seeing their truth. You only see them as the way that they're projected into the world. Very much like how you see yourself when you look in a mirror. So the mirror stage is the period in one's life where we kind of come to terms with the fact that just as we see others as images, outward images of themselves, we see ourselves as images, as seen in the mirror, as autonomous images separated from, some kind of like truth in terms of like being our, the person that birthed us or whatever. Like there's more to it than that, my 5-second Lacan pitch. But in any case, I hope that this helps illustrate it here. So in terms of some vocabulary legwork here, he says that when the ego looks at itself, he calls this an example of positive negation, because you have this positive activity of the ego looking at itself as a passive being. Whereas he calls the act of the ego looking upon the non-ego, so not itself, looking at the world, he calls this relative negation. That's it's not super important. I mean, people who study this stuff very deeply, I'm sure, would get into the weeds about what this actually means, the distinction in these terms. It's not going to be super relevant as we go forward for the sake of, this more, I don't know if these presentations are really introductory, but, that we're not doing a PhD thesis here. So we don't have to get into the weeds of the distinction between these terms. It's just that it is what he calls the positive negation when you have the positive conscious being looking upon itself versus when it's looking upon not itself, not a positive thing, looking at the quote unquote negative. But not negative as in being bad, you get it, whatever. But in either case, we see that there's a kind of cause and effect relationship happening here, where in the act of observing, you actually lend a kind of like reality to the thing that's being observed, whether it's the external world or the self, or whether it's the consciousness looking upon itself. And this is an interesting moment, and this would be one of my big critiques of Fichte's text here. He says that this is a kind of cause and effect that transcends time, because it doesn't happen as a vector of time. When you look at yourself, or like, it's not like something is being created through a movement in space that is measured in accordance to time. It's like an instantaneous thing that is a product of the very act of consciousness itself. As consciousness exists, in its instantaneous existence, or in its existence, it instantaneously lends a kind of like reality to the world, which, again, not idealism, the world then affects it. So there's a kind of cause and effect here that doesn't follow the very strict Kantian idea, where for Kant, this is one of the properties of kind of the transcendental faculties of existence, is that as humans, we're able to process cause and effect. We're able to understand it. And we're able to attribute transcendental determination to it, that is it's being universal, without actually seeing every moment of cause and effect to verify it. So we haven't seen every single cause produce every single effect to know that everything works by the law of cause and effect. So we're able to infer from a small set of data, the very few moments of cause and effect that we've actually witnessed in our lives compared to the continuum of all of existence. Like we only see a sliver of it. we're able to infer from that sliver a more general, universal, transcendental quality of cause and effect at all. However, here, Fichte is saying that the kind of give and take relationship between the ego and the non-ego is a cause and effect relationship that does not happen in accordance with time. It doesn't happen across through the intersection of time and space. It is rather instantaneous. And this isn't something that he elaborates on. And it's very interesting because later in the book, he'll just kind of allocate a few paragraphs to talking about time, and then that's it. When this should be really considered. And then later on, a century and a half later, you'd have someone like Martin Heidegger who's like, actually, yeah, all we have is time. We can do away with space. Because honestly, when we're trying to connect with people or with ourselves, what we're doing is shrinking space. We're being with, he says. And so in that, there's a kind of shrinking of distance. We are physically still distant. No two people are ever fully 100% molded into one another. That's not a thing. But we, in the act of being with others, we are shrinking space. So we kind of abstract away from that, but we always live in accordance with time. Don't know if you just heard my cat. Specifically, we always live with the knowledge of our deaths as an eventuality on the trajectory of time. Okay, so in all this, sorry for the detour. In all of this, how is it possible then for the ego to be both active and passive? How can it both be the active seeing subject and seeing itself as a passive thing? And well, it's hard to say. In his words, he says that the ego is active in its engagement with itself as self-positing, or the non-ego as passive. Such engagement reveals a moment, even the observed ego, of passivity that is carved out of the totality of reality as active. That last part was me. But when you think about the totality of reality as having a connection with an observing ego, it is only an observing ego that is able to give any kind of totality to reality at all, to posit its existence as there. Any single moment of it, be it an element of the non-ego or the ego itself, like a moment of consciousness, is a moment that is kind of traced out of the totality of reality that is the product of the active, seeing, engaging consciousness. But when you take that sliver, when you take that part, what you are doing is effectively taking away part of the active whole, and you're leaving a kind of passive part that is now under the specific examination of it. But the thing is, and this is, if any of you end up actually reading this book, or if you've read it before, you know that Fichte kind of flip-flops. And he's doing this very deliberately. It's not like he's doing bad philosophy or anything. But he's like, okay, well, in that moment where we've now carved out this piece, this becomes the active moment of the totality of reality. Because in the end, or truthfully, we can't experience that totality of reality. It doesn't actually exist because we can never experience it in its totality. We can only ever experience it in these parts that we take as active and that we transcendentally then apply to the whole as being part of a kind of wholeness of reality. And so we have a kind of passivity taken of a thing or of a moment that then becomes the active part in determining the activity of the wholeness of reality. So think of it like this. Think of it like a detective. If you're a detective and you're trying to solve a crime, and I won't use a grim example or anything, you're trying to solve a crime. Just imagine whatever crime comes to your mind. And you're grabbing pieces of evidence, but you don't know if those pieces of evidence connect to the whole, the crime itself, in painting the picture of the crime. On their own, they might just be parts that are not actually actively engaged in contributing to that whole. And it's only when you're able to like fit it together, all these parts in their passivity, do they then assume the active role in constructing that totality of the image of that crime. Very much like the and this is exactly, well, not exactly. I mean, I'm taking a little bit of creative purchase just to try to illustrate this. This is what happens with any moment that you are experiencing in consciousness. You only see a part. What I described before, like if you're listening to me driving, you're only seeing like a part of all of reality. And it's just a chunk, and therefore it's passive. You're just kind of witnessing it. But then in the reflection upon it, you are then able to inscribe upon it a sort of active role in being evidence of the totality of existence that extends beyond it as an active projection of a mind, of an ego that effectively it's engaging with it, that has a kind of engagement with it, that then itself shapes that mind. Because remember, we're not idealists here. God, I hope that I hope that analogy landed with you. So in this, it should be really clear that there is no neat distinction between activity or passivity. The non-ego shapes us, we shape the non-ego, and therefore there is no very neat distinction between the ego and the non-ego. They shape one another. And we are disturbing all of these elements here. We're disturbing the idea of activity, we're disturbing the idea of the ego, of passivity, etc. So one of the ways that Fichte tries to illustrate this is with the example of light and dark, where he says that light and dark aren't really opposites, rather they're just like separated by degrees. So he says that the part isn't opposite to the whole, rather they're just separated by degrees, and that they actually are dependent upon one another in their difference, which isn't like opposites that are therefore separate from one another. They have a kind of harmony between them. Personally, I prefer my detective example. I don't know if detective tales were like really a thing back then. I really have no idea. I'm not a historian, but you're telling me. Am I a better example giver than Fichte? Maybe make me feel good. Make my day. So what unites these opposites, I'll just call opposites, like light and dark or ego, non-ego, even though we've kind of upset the idea that they're truly opposites, is that they have this reciprocal determination, which is still to be kind of found. And it's to be found ultimately in this absolute ego or within consciousness itself that is able to, to bridge things that don't seem to have any kind of like commonality between them. This is like anthropology 101. Basic kind of pop psychology knowledge is like humans are pattern finding machines, which is like, yeah, it's a thing that you hear and we take our walrus fins and we clap our walrus fins and we think this is the greatest bit of insight we've ever heard. And indeed, there's some amount of truth to it. But what's more interesting is not that human beings have a certain capacity to find patterns. But I'm always interested in then what we're implying that means. Like, why is it that we draw the patterns that we draw and not other patterns? Why is it that we're so eager to act on some patterns and not others? To me, those are the much more interesting questions than anything else. But, whatever. But interestingly, to go back, the reciprocity between the two components here, between ego and non-ego, or the ground, is what makes it possible for the active or passive parts to be present at all. And so it's only when there's a kind of connection that either side is able to take on either role, which then undoes itself, which then reestablishes itself, and then you have a part shape the whole, and then the whole shape the part, and then you have this entire mixing of all the stuff going on. And it's like this. You see it as a continuum and no longer these neat distinctions. But now for the real fire. This is where he gets a little bit wacky, where he's like, if we're saying that reciprocity plays this role in making it possible for the active agent or passive agents to exist at all, aren't we then saying that reciprocity, the very grounding between the two sides, is itself a kind of active role, or itself has an active role. And this is exactly what he means by the synthesis, where you have the ego as, let's say, thesis, the non-ego as antithesis, or we can reverse the two. The synthesis is finding the activity in the union of the two. This is different from, like, whatever kind of Hegel idea we can attribute to the dialectic or thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or Marx, or anything like this. And everyone has a different idea about dialectic. This is why one of those, whenever anyone uses the term dialectic, and I really don't mean to be like stubborn, I sit there and I'm like, I have no idea what you mean. Like, I really don't know what you mean. Like, do you mean it in terms of like how people have understood Marx or Hegel or Fichte or Kant or Plato? Like, what? These are all very different ideas about what the dialectic is. And he takes it even a step further to be like, well, okay, then there's still the active part of that very act of recognizing the active role of reciprocity on the part of the intelligent being that has consciousness, that's like, oh, it is the reciprocity that has the active role, which is itself now saying that it is that subject proclaiming that, the intelligent being, that has the active role. And so there's this constant deferral of activity. And in so doing, we see that it doesn't have a kind of stability or an easy, like, single location. It's always being kind of deferred, to use like a Derrida term. It's like it never has it never settles with itself. And this is exactly how it settles with itself. Is like it is deferring itself onto otherness. And this is what kind of lends it its coherence. And this is something that so often is just so fundamentally denied by everyone from our scientists to politicians, is like things have to be stable, or at least is the claim. And then we let the capitalists be as wacky and out of control as we want. And that's apparently has its own coherence that we're not willing to attribute to anything else. Like, you have a gender, you better be consistent with it, or you're going to make everyone lose their minds, And it goes to show the way that these what I think are fundamental qualities of existence that Fichte is identifying here, which is essentially saying that these qualities are not really consistent at all. They're still qualities, but they're always changing. Like, I think this is a really important lesson to take. It's important to embrace the complexity of existence, of life, of experience, of consciousness. I think these are really things to embrace. So just as before, when activity and passivity kind of canceled each other out, or we found that they weren't so distinct, now he's saying that activity and reciprocity cancel themselves out. So now it's like you have this grounding that makes activity possible, but you have an active, intelligible subject that makes that reciprocity possible. That is saying, like, look, there must be a connection between the two. So you see that these two things then undermine one another. And this is like the kind of, that you can just see how much Fichte is really wrestling with these ideas here, which Hegel will take up, I think, in a lot more. And I really think it's because Fichte laid this groundwork that Hegel was like, this is how we take the next step from Kant. Kant is like, look, you have the subject experiencing the world. These are the faculties of experience that make it possible, and these are the qualities of the physical world and its properties, etc. But Hegel's like, look, we experience the world differently, right? And this is something that Kant picked up on. But even within any individual subject, every moment of reality is different. How can we find a kind of continuity between all these differences? How is it possible for us to have, like, to be so okay with difference if, as Kant says, we're just like programmed in a certain way with our faculties of the mind, like we're able to intuit space and time and shape and magnitude and all that. How is it that we're so okay with things that somehow move beyond that? Which is questions that Kant asks in the third critique. He kind of like sets the stage for where Fichte and I mean, this is why they're so brilliant, but in whatever. Sorry. So the way around all this to kind of deal with how opposites have now collapsed into non-opposites and activities, passivity, activities, reciprocity, vice versa, ego, non-ego, vice versa. He's like, the way we get around this is just by fully embracing consciousness as a being, which let's just call it that, or as like a thing, whatever, that always contains what is not it within it. And it is all in its positing itself, in its just existing, it is always positing otherness in itself that is imparted onto it. And this is the very like function of consciousness. And that puts us here into the second part of the theoretical part of the science of knowledge. And there's a lot more to the book, but he gets really repetitive. And so once you kind of establish all the groundwork, you see it's so clear that he just couldn't take the next step that Hegel would take. So, the rest of the book will happen fairly quickly. Not super quickly, but anyways. Now, after having established the ground of the ego and non-ego, the reciprocity here, he wants to consider the capacity for like sensation and how sensation opens up the third link beyond the thesis and antithesis, how we're able to have feeling at all. And the question of feeling would be so fundamental in the history of philosophy. Kant's third critique really takes up this question in interesting ways, where Kant is like, isn't it fascinating how we're able to have an experience with things that we cannot reduce to concepts? Like, even things that we share. Like, we're able to have mutual feelings of, or we're able to mutually recognize something as beautiful. That's kind of redundant, but in any case, without being able to explain why. I can look at a rose or a work of art and I can say it's beautiful, but I can't say, which implies that other people will agree with me. No one says that something's beautiful and they're like, it's just beautiful to me. Like that doesn't exist. It's not just in the eye of the beholder, because then we wouldn't have anything like art at all. Art implies that there are things that are enjoyed by more than one person. And so by virtue of that, it tells us that two or more people can have a shared experience of a thing that we cannot, like, quote unquote, rationally or with language, like, explain what is universally appealing about this. We just kind of feel it. Like, it's just kind of universe. Like, we feel, we have this common feeling attached to it. And so earlier, you'd have like Spinoza in his Ethics. If you read the Ethics, like the entire ending, like the whole second half of the Ethics, he's just like defining emotions, which is super boring, but super fascinating, because like he was recognizing the importance of like experience. Like what does it mean to have an engagement or to be affected by things in the world as a constitutive part of having a rational engagement, like a philosophical engagement with the world. And so he wasn't like separating these two, like emotionality and rationality, like none of that nonsense. Like these things go hand in hand to any true thinker out there. Like they aren't separate at all. So for the ego to experience sensation, it must limit itself in conformity to the limits of the non-ego, that is, the object that it encounters. So as such, the ego embraces a moment of kind of finitude. When you experience something, you're like being frozen. You're being attached to whatever it is that is experiencing you. And so you're kind of bounded by it. This is a moment in which the world is kind of placing a limit on you, not you as consciousness limiting the world. It's kind of putting a limit on you. So it kind of embraces a moment of finitude, of a limit, while remaining aware of its capacity to extend further than that moment to potentially infinity. This is one of the great mysteries of consciousness, is like, how far does it extend? How big is consciousness? We'll never know. It cannot be known. It's like, to use an analogy, it's like if you have a computer and it has a memory stick or memory drive on it, you can see how much it can hold. We have no idea how much consciousness can hold. Like, is it infinite? Is the infinity that we attribute to the universe just a reflection of the infinity of our minds? Like, who knows? Maybe it is. We'll never know. This would be for Kant, and one of the antinomies of reason. It's like we can't know, so what's the point of asking? Like maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We're never going to know. But this limitation plays a very important role, because in the moment of feeling something and feeling the limit, it's only in that moment that we're able to move beyond the limit, that we're able to imply a moving beyond, or use words properly, David, that we're able to employ something that allows us to extend beyond the limit. And that is intelligence or imagination, which is a very fascinating thing in the order of all living beings, because it is something that allows us to move beyond, kind of like what I was saying earlier about Kant, because Kant was asking these questions too. It's like, how do we have this capacity that allows us to move beyond just being affected by things? So we can be limited in the moment of feeling something, being affected by it, but then it is by virtue of that limitation that we're able to move beyond. So for the ego to be able to limit something for sensation, it's being affected by something, that must mean that thing must already be somewhat familiar to the ego. And again, this is something that Kant picks up on, where he's like, when we're affected by something, we're implying that there's a moment in the act of it kind of touching us, like affecting us, like as though when you see something, the image of that thing has to have a kind of like our bodies, our senses, and our minds, or really he's talking about our bodies here, have a kind of apparatus that is able to receive that thing in a way as to like be common with other people. So therefore we have a kind of common receptive experience of a thing, like as though it is a shape and our body has a kind of receptacle to receive that shape. Otherwise it would be unintelligible to us. We wouldn't be able to make sense of it, but we can. Now, to kind of riff on the Kant thing a little more, there are examples when things exceed that. And this is what he calls the sublime. There are sublime objects, like objects that exceed what we can reasonably conceive of, like a mountain. If you stand next to a big mountain, like if you ever go to the Alps or you stand next to Fuji or whatever, some big mountain in the Rockies in Canada or something, you might have this experience of being like, it kind of rattles your brain a little bit. You're like, you cannot comprehend the magnitude of the thing before you. And Kant is like, you're taking that image in. Like, there's no denying that. It's still an effective experience. However, it is not a beautiful experience because it exceeds your reason's capacity to intuit its grandeur, to make sense of its size and shape and everything. And so he says that this produces a certain, like, it makes us feel small, kind of, and it's like something that happens in us. It makes us feel kind of small and limited. And he calls this sublime because it exceeds our capacity of reason to make sense of the object, of the experience. But for the most part, most objects that we experience are intelligible to us. This is why he says this thing must already be familiar somewhat or intelligible to the ego when it affects us and places a limit on us. So in his words, the ego limits it. Hence, it must be in the ego. So when you see a flower, you're seeing just the flower, which is always fascinating. Like if you're walking through a field and you come across a beautiful flower, you never just see that flower, right? You're seeing all the other stuff around it. You look at the flower, maybe, it's a weird noise. Sorry. When you see the flower, you never just see the flower. You're seeing the leaves around it. You're seeing the grass that lies underneath it. You're seeing the dust floating through the air. But you're able to kind of single out and be immediately affected by that flower. This is a moment where the mind is placing a kind of like limit upon that object of experience that then affects you. And in that moment, you're limited in your being affected by that object. So this is what he means when he says the ego limits it, hence it must be in the ego. We must then acknowledge that they aren't separate at all then. There is this relationship between the things that we see and us. So as far as the ego's process, like as far as it functions, it works through freedom, that is activity, to attach an image, gives a kind of like structure to whatever's being experienced to some object in space. So he's relying here upon another Kantian idea of like freedom. That is, for Kant, and this would take a lot more to unpack, but we are free beings insofar as we act in accordance with a kind of moral agency in the world, where we act in a way that isn't just like predetermined in any neatly, established way. We act in a way that is imperfect because we are not God. We're just beings. And so we can still, though, act in accordance with the possibility of being in conformity with a moral law. And this is what I think a lot of people get wrong about Kant's idea of morality. If anyone knows about his idea of the categorical imperative, it essentially states, act as though your actions can be construed as a universal law. And his idea is not that there's any specific set of laws out there that we should adhere to, which is why he doesn't give any specific examples. Instead, what he's saying, that isn't it like, don't we all think that we're acting morally? Like nobody acts and they're like, I am so glad I am acting immorally right now. Like even if people do reprehensible stuff, they're still believe themselves to be acting morally. And so Kant picks up on this point to be like, isn't that fascinating? Like, doesn't this imply that we have some kind of attachment to a transcendental idea about morality? Because we're all committed to it. We all might have different ideas of morality, but what remains constant is that we think we are moral. And so he's like, we must accept this, and then from here, then we try to attune our actions to be in accordance with others' ideas of morality, which doesn't always work out well. And of course, there are problems with this formulation, but I think it makes total sense within his overall project. It's like, what is universal between the differences between us? And that's the very idea of morality itself, which is universal in this case. But this is the key for freedom. That is, for him, morality is a sign of our capacity to act freely, to make moral judgments, and to act in a way that is moral or maybe immoral, but that is only dependent upon us being free beings that don't always just act in accordance with pure moral law, because that doesn't exist. Only God would act. Every single one of God's actions are in accordance with pure moral law. But don't get it twisted. Kant isn't like out there saying that God is this like anthropomorphic, Bible thing that just like, is a dude and acts good. Like, that's not what he's saying. He's like, if there is a thing called God, it is what is morally pure. But we can't know what that is, and we can't, it's not scripture, it's not anything clear like that. Now, the space bit is important that I mentioned earlier, at least in the last part from Fichte, I said, where as far as the ego's process functions, it works through freedom to attach an image to some objects in space. But that is what is actually required to lend the very existence to space itself, where space doesn't really exist. And the irony of space, or the contradiction of space, is that in order for it to be recognized at all, we need objects to be used as points of distinction between points in order to identify what is not those objects. That is what lies between those objects, i.e., in other words, space. So in order for us to identify space at all, we need non-space. Or, in the case of time, works very similarly. In order for us to process time, we need to have moments that are frozen, singular moments that we can then compare with one another to be able to measure the passage of time, to be able to measure time itself. So these are more concrete ways in which opposites are necessary to kind of give identity to either side and to be the ground, to be the totality of the whole itself in their distinction. But that is what makes anything possible. To define space, you need non-space. To define time, you need non-time. To define the self, you need the non-self. And the same goes on. To activity, you need non-activity. God, non-God. Vice versa. And the synthesis of the whole, the totality of existence, it happens like spontaneously in the ego's like experiencing the world at all in itself. It's like, this is the real like beauty of what's going on in experience. And then he talks about time in a more direct way. He spends like 3 pages talking about time, and he explains that time works successively. Obviously, like time works, in an ordering, it's successively, one moment after another, after another, after another. Whereas space is all, space is simultaneous, not successive. Space exists all at once. Like there is no, space doesn't follow itself. It's just, space is totality right now, whereas time is like not all right now. God would experience time all at one time, but we experience time successively. So like I said, we need finite chunks of space to be able to process the totality of space, and we need finite, like specific moments in time to be able to process the infinity of the chain of time. But that's like kind of what he gives us in terms of this, and it's kind of interesting that he doesn't really elaborate more, even though I think that there's a lot more to unpack. And by the way, what I've said, I feel like I'm being faithful to what Fichte is going after here, but he doesn't give us quite that much. I mean, I filled in some blanks a little bit to try to make it clear what he's after, but it's not totally clear to me. And I find it so strange. He barely talks about this at all, but it seems so important, and it pretty much just concludes his book. Or concludes this section, which will lead into the final bit. But space and time depend upon one another. So insofar as you have infinite space that is only recognizable by looking at finite space and then intuiting or kind of inferring beyond that, the same thing with time, like I said. He says that space and time, at least their connection, is only possible with a third item as well. So you have space, or you have finite space and infinite space that are connected with like an object. Like you need an object that will allow you to be able to intuit finite space, then from there infinite space. Same with time. You have finite time, infinite time, but you have a moment that allows you to then identify finite time, and from there infinite time. So there's a kind of triad occurring here. Similarly, you have space and time and their connection that is only ever made really possible by the intuiting subject. And this is what Kant talks about right at the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason. You have a subject that is able to hold the transcendental unity of space and time within them. That is, we don't know if space and time even exist, let alone if they have a connection with one another outside of human perception. There's no way to know. And we need this kind of, third subject, the ego in this case, to be able to unify the whole. And so it shows that all three are connected. This is the kind of trinity of experience. You have subject as a synthesis between space and time, giving them their connection and coherence, which then works upon the subject, allowing us to have experience at all, and vice versa. And it is this shape, this unity, that is the possibility of there being a kind of architecture to experience. Do we call this God's design? Who knows? I mean, it's like, we can't know. But it is a fascinating element of experience itself, or of existence. And that puts us into the final section, or well, the final two sections. The first part of the practical part of the science of knowledge, in which he's going to be thinking about morality. But again, it's very quick here. So the ego, as we said, depends upon the non-ego for its intelligence, for its existence, its activity at all. So the practical part here will look at the ego in moral action. So to make the leap to morality, he reminds us the absolute ego contains the ground for the ego's self-positing in relation to non-ego. So the absolute ego, he's saying, is like what unites, is the ground of determination of synthesis between the ego and the non-ego. More specifically, I'd say it's like the highest order of whatever we think consciousness emerges from that gives the possibility of consciousness to have a connection with what is not it. So the absolute ego thus opens the possibility for the ego's grasp of the infinite, insofar as there appears to be no end to the ego's capacity to experience the world. You know, you never really grow tired of experience. Like, you're always taking in new sense data, and it seems like we can keep doing it. Sure, the psychologists will say, oh, well, you know, your brain contains certain, filters so that you don't get bombarded with stuff. Yeah, all good, whatever. But, you're always taking stuff in, and we don't know how much you can actually hold in there. Goes back to the question, is consciousness infinite? And it certainly seems to be, if not infinite, pretty big. However, any engagement with the non-ego is only a moment and a limitation, and therefore is not infinite. And like we said before, it is then from there, this limitation, we're able to imply a beyond. And it's a beyond that goes on and on and on to what we assume to be infinity. It therefore contains both in itself, both the infinite and the finite in itself. So the ego's capacity for the infinite is its capacity to comprehend the world in itself, even if it can never actually be experienced. In his words, then, the absolute ego posits itself as the totality of all reality. In applying this positing to the infinite, the objective world, the ego becomes a practical or moral ego. It is simply moral and gives the moral or ideal world the world to be posited. And this is it helps obviously a lot if you kind of understand Kant here. And that is the idea that there is for Kant, as human beings, we experience the world not in its truth, its noumenon. Like, we only experience the phenomenon, that is what is made available to us in our senses. But as human beings, because we are material, we exist in both worlds. We exist in a kind of noumenal world because there are parts of us that exceed our ability to experience ourselves. And there are parts of us that exist within the material world, the parts of us that we can see and feel and touch, that is, feel and smell, whatever, parts that are open to phenomena. But we exist in both worlds. Okay, little side point, some hardcore people who study this would be like, don't call it worlds, they aren't worlds. I get it. I'm just using it for the sake of explanation. But you have these two distinct arenas, realms, I don't know, elements of existence, and what exceeds existence, what goes beyond it. And so what he's saying here is that because the ego contains within it both the finite world and the possibility of moving beyond it, it therefore contains within it the world as it is and the ideal world, that which goes beyond what we can experience. Similarly, he says that as moral beings, we have agency to exist and make choices in the world, but we also have the potential to imagine an ideal way to exist. And if we go back to Kant, this is exactly what Kant says with the categorical imperative. He's like, we might all have different ideas what is right and wrong, but we should act in a way that we imagine that our action would be done the same way by everybody, which I think is a pretty decent way to think about the world. It's like, is it immoral to steal bread? I think that's the wrong way to put the question, Kant would say. Kant would say, Well, what is the circumstance? Are you starving? You need to feed your family? Would anyone in your circumstance steal the bread? Maybe then that's the moral thing to do. Like, I know that that's a contentious claim for hardcore Kantians out there. They'd be like, no, he would always see that as being wrong. I don't know if I'm totally convinced about that. I think that there's more room within Kant's framework not to just like immediately adhere to what is now established as like law, like stealing bad, but instead it's more of like an organic relationship with morality as an abstract concept that transcends law and that might mean doing unlawful things. Like, I don't know. I mean, this is why Kant didn't really give any examples, except he's like, don't lie, whatever. But, you know, that's silly. So the ideal world implies this idea of there being a moral kind of truth, insofar as we can posit there being an infinity outside of our finity. We can imply that there's a morality, a kind of true, pure morality outside of our just like individual acting freely in the world. So in his words here, without the practical moral faculty of the ego, the intelligence is not possible. Or intelligence is not possible. For unless the ego goes beyond the check, there is no check. And this is why we have to, like, it is only in the act of having a limitation that we're able to enact a kind of intelligence or imagination to move beyond it. And so these two things are seen as being necessary. Infinity depends on finity or finitude or the finite. And so we're always returning to this idea that opposites depend upon one another. And that puts us here into the second part of the practical part of the science of knowledge. Now he starts with a brief consideration of the ego's desire or impulse to pursue a non-ego at all. Like, why does it engage with what is not it at all? So, as we've said, the obvious reason is to actualize itself. It's only by actually engaging with something in the world that it is able to grow to be itself at all. But that reason implies an abstraction from the encounter in the attribution of another cause. That is, in experiencing the world, we're saying that there's a kind of impulse that derives from somewhere else. We have to leave room for the possibility that the ego feels something in the spontaneous reaction with the non-ego. That the ego gets something out of experience in the first place. It doesn't just, like, we don't find meaning in this because the ego is like, we attribute some kind of abstract idea that the ego has a relationship with the external world to actualize itself, because this is moving away and attributing a kind of like deferred cause to this whole arrangement. We have to think of this spontaneously, that consciousness like does this right off the bat, and this is necessary. Like it's not like consciousness ever does not do it. It is always doing it. So the ego feels something in the spontaneous interaction with the non-ego. This is like, Kant would call this like purposiveness, how an object like affects us, and it can affect us mutually, and it happens like unconsciously, so to speak. So this feeling, he says, is the ground of all reality. This connection, the sensibility that is not sensibility, because it's like consciousness, doesn't feel per se, but it is a connection that is happening spontaneously right there with the world. So only that which is experienced without contemplation is truly believed. So this new kind of opposite here is formed by yearning and limitation, where yearning kind of compels the ego to go out of itself. And that's only possible by limitation. Yearning, limitation, intelligence, limitation, moving beyond limitation, infinity, finitude, they all work together. So the non-ego, in its active role that we've already kind of disturbed or deconstructed, is responsible for the limiting that produces this feeling, whatever it is, and that therefore pushes the ego to yearn for more. And so there's this constant movement. The ego is in harmony with the limit for only a moment before yearning again. With the limit for only a moment before yearning again. So it must be in harmony with its own movement. And this is like key. This is it. Like, this is how he concludes the book, is like, ultimately, it doesn't have a kind of easily definable set of attributes. They're all the attributes blend into one another. But what remains constant is the kind of totality of consciousness of the ego as something that contains otherness within itself, and that is always developing, always moving, always changing, yet remaining consistent with itself as a changing, moving thing. That's like, the only consistency is change. Like that thing. That old, I don't know, what's the word? I don't know, phrase or whatever. And that's the end of the book. But I want to talk briefly about his other text, which just is attached to just the end of the version I have, called The Dignity of Man, which I think is really beautiful. And I was really surprised to read it, because I was like, oh, damn, okay. Fichte, you could write something like heartfelt. Because everything so far was just so kind of technical and philosophical. But he says that it is only through, in the dignity of man, he says it is only through living perceptions that the world attains its ordered nature. Simply enough. Only by experiencing it that it attains its kind of ordering. Moreover, as humankind progresses, so will the order of the world. Very romanticized, positivist idea, the world and kind of develops with the humans as humans are steadily developing. Meanwhile, anyone with any amount of rationality, if I dare say, would recognize that it seems like we are regressing. Does it really think globally things are getting better? Don't know about that. He does say, though, that to his credit, that everyone qualifies as a human, which is, at the time, it's hard to celebrate anyone for saying this now, but, in the 18th century, early 19th century, he's saying that it's important to recognize that every human is a human, and there are no different degrees of humanity. He's like, all of us are the same of the same species, which I think is a very, very important, beautiful thing to lay out at this time. But he has this passage that I think is just really beautiful, where he says that we are all I. That's what unites us all. And in his words, he says, all individuals are included in the one great unity of pure spirit. Let this be the last word with which I recommend myself to your remembrance, and the remembrance to which I recommend myself to you. And I was like, damn, that's really good. Let this be the last word with which I recommend myself to your memory, and the memory to which I recommend myself to you. And I'm like, yeah. I really like it. I think it's pretty. But yeah, it's a little longer than I thought it was going to be. Maybe I gave a little bit too much background with Kant and Hegel and all that. But I hope that you found that useful or interesting. Maybe it gave you a different outlook on the world. Maybe you'll forget about it in 25 minutes and you'll move on with your life. But in any case, if you like what I did, you can let me know or tell me if I got anything wrong. If you want to support me, there are links in the descriptions. And yeah, I hope you're all doing well, and take care.